Good morning, everybody. I hope we're all feeling good. Just welcoming you all in here to our webinar, as you can see from the screen here. Just want to give us a couple seconds to get everyone situated, get us comfortable. Everyone, I can see folks joining us. So if you can, again, we want to make sure during this webinar that the chat is super active. So if you could just kick us off with the right energy and toss in the chat your name, where you're calling in from, and just for a little bit of fun, give us the first word you think of when you hear a term like internal development for your organization. So in the chat, if you'd be so kind as to toss in your name, where you're calling in from, and the first word that comes to mind, and we'll see what we get here in the chat. But we're getting some more folks coming in. Want to welcome you all in. Hello, Kelly. Hello, Noel from the UK. Happy that you're here with us this morning to talk about how to build high-performing teams through internal development and with internal development. So very excited as we kind of get everything going here. Word is reflection is on internal development. That's very interesting. I think reflection, even on a employee level, but for organizations too, reflecting on kind of how this makes sense. And the other word is coaching there too. Very nice. Coaching is going to be, I think, play a role when we talk about some of the tangible stuff that could be going on. So again, want to welcome you in. Carlton, hello. Rona, hello. Processes, good stuff, calling in from all over the United States. Good morning to you. That's an early morning. Really appreciate you being here, of course. But yeah, let's just get us kicked off. Today, we're talking about how to build high-performing teams with internal development. And I'll very quickly tell you that my name is Max, and I work as a senior HR content expert at Personio. Personio is an HR software that helps manage each stage of the employee lifecycle, from recruiting all the way through to offboarding. And I'm very excited to talk today because I have some very interesting statistics and data behind the case for internal development in your organizations. But I'd much rather pass it off to my esteemed co-panelist, Aisling, who's going to be joining us. Over to you, Aisling, for a quick intro.
Thank you so much, Max, and thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion today. So my name is Aisling McNamara, and I am the Learning and Development Manager at LearnUpon. So our team covers three main areas, which is learning, enablement, and inclusion. So we have a nice wide remit. We're coming up to about 300 employees, and our focus is really that internal training and making sure that that's available to everyone. And then in terms of what LearnUpon is, we are an LMS company, and our mission is all around partnering with businesses that believes that learning can deliver results. So in a nutshell, get to work in learning, in a learning company, get to be customer zero of our LMS and speak about learning pretty much all day long. So a really, really nice position to be in, and super excited to chat about this topic.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can see Aisling a little bit better. We can have like a real conversation. But I think we want to kick things off by talking through that imperative, really, about internal development for a lot of organizations. So I'm going to start off just by saying that some of the data in my conversations, I've had the great privilege of being able to talk to HR experts over the past 4 years on a variety of topics, executives, HR professionals, and a lot of the data coming out shows that this is from Zippia in 2023, that 76% of employees are looking for opportunities to expand their careers. So there is an active appetite for people trying to expand their careers. And a different survey from Better Buys found that employees who do get professional development opportunities are 15% more engaged in their roles. That's on top of current engagement, 15% more almost instantly, and have 34% more retention when compared to those who do not get professional development opportunities. That's on the basis of development budgets and development programs that organizations are running, participants versus non-participants. So really, for organizations to thrive, they need to invest that time and effort to align their programs with the desires of the employees. But what we can see from the data, Aisling, and sending it over to you, people have a huge appetite for this. This is not something that they view as maybe not even as a privilege. They view it as a right for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, for sure. I think having some kind of structured internal development is probably a must-have rather than a nice-to-have for any employees. I'm sure anyone dialed in that has done any interviews recently, it's a number one question for candidates. I actually think most candidates expect you to have things in place already. They expect an education stipend. They expect you to have LinkedIn Learning, having an LMS. Like, I think if you don't have those, that's almost a little bit unusual these days. So I do think, like you said, anyone coming into the business will have that expectation. And then we know from your stats, they're going to be more engaged, they're going to be retained in the business. And I don't know any HR team or L&D team that doesn't want those results. So I think that's why it really matters. And then, I think a lot of companies just need to look at, is this a priority for us? Are we doing it well? And how do we think about it is probably more so the question rather than do we need to do it? Because I think that's probably just a given at this point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, especially as part of today's conversation, we talk a lot about the cost of running an organization, period, but also the cost of external hiring. It's not cheap to staff up a department, to have all those processes in place in order to do it well, or to do it at a very exceptionally high level. And you still need to do some of that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of, skill development and skills gaps in your organization. But that development piece is so huge from even a return on investment perspective, because you build that learning platform in order to nourish and foster the talent you have to hand. And that's so important. The people that you have on staff are not only important for your business, but it is important that they continue to grow. And I think, especially when we look into the data, that's especially true for your top talent, for your top performers. They are demanding development.
Yeah, and I think like most companies are, reliant on their people to be successful. And I think there's a really interesting interaction between, like, as a company, we're most likely going to need you to upskill or reskill during your time with us because we're responding to what our business needs are. And we all know, like, things like AI, any kind of industry changes. Each year that you are doing L&D or HR or whatever it might be, you're usually trying to respond to one of those. And then the next piece of the puzzle is, okay, well, I need actually this team to upskill or reskill and help us deliver value in a different way. And then on the employee side, as you said, Max, employees want to develop, we want to progress, we want to feel like, we're here for a meaningful experience, not just for work. And that's pretty common, I think, across a lot of industries these days. So I think internal development for me is the way that those two things interact and the way that I can help the business to get the upskilling that they need, but also that our people can get the development that they want. And it's trying to find whatever intersection is there and then make it meaningful for both sides. And like you said, that's probably the key to unlocking the return on investment of internal development, because you're making it work for both sides rather than just having it there and not being impactful.
Exactly. And the statistical case is quite clear that it is a win-win formulation to have formalized, tangible programs in place for an organization. And this will go into my next question here, or the next topic of discussion, as well as the benefit that it brings to the business in terms of satisfaction, engagement, and baseline productivity for a lot of people. They're learning in order to get better, not learning in order to get worse. That is kind of the pursuit of getting better at your job. And that is better for business ultimately, because you're developing those skills at scale. But that's something I want to talk about, because folks in the chat, folks in attending here are probably coming from organizations of all different sizes. So we talk about the business case, of course, but also knowing when it's time and what a learning program maybe looks like for a company of 5 or 15 or 50 people versus one that's for 200 to 2,000 or something like that. So how do you start to think through that, formalizing the process now that we know it is so important?
Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting question because it's hard to know in a company when is the right time, what is the right fit for us at this size. So maybe just to share a little bit around, I joined LearnUpon 3 years ago to set up learning and development there. So I got to start from scratch, which was a really cool experience. And about then we were maybe 150 people, and the main internal development was happening on an Excel sheet where employees could request any kind of external courses that they wanted. And that was kept track of, which actually I thought was pretty good progress for that size, if I'm being honest. The fact that it was all written down is a positive, because sometimes that doesn't happen. And I think if that's where you're at as a company, at least that's a starting point, and you're saying to your employees, look, we may not have a formal program around this yet, but you are absolutely able to request and engage with us around your development. And we do care about it. Now, we're heading now towards 300 people. That wasn't going to scale with us or, be fit for purpose anymore. So we have been on a journey over the last couple of years to really try and formalize what internal development means to us. And I think maybe to speak about LearnUpon, then we can, Max, chat about kind of the wider context of what other companies are doing. But one thing for us that made a really big difference in hopefully making internal development impactful was building a competency framework and having expectations in place so that people understood, okay, I know what my role is, I know what my level is, and I can understand where I'm sitting and where I want to go. So for us to go from, using the Excel sheet to get the courses into a much more structured conversation in just a couple of years has really transformed the impact, and we've already gotten loads of good feedback. So it's been interesting to see that progression for us. And then the other thing that came to mind for this question is a lot of employees maybe offer an education stipend and they say, okay, €1,000 to go and spend on whatever courses you want. And that's kind of their stamp on internal development. And there's nothing else happening outside of that. And I think, again, like the Excel sheet, it's good to have something in place, but I do wonder, is that the most impactful way? And I'd be curious if anyone wants to share in the chat if they have experience of that, because it's something candidates ask us all the time, and I'm still not 100% sold on it. So I think you can see like companies are doing lots of different things in this area. They're just doing them to different degrees of impactfulness, I would say.
Agree on the chat part. If anyone has any questions, of course, please ask questions at any time. We'll try to pick them up midstream or save them for the Q&A portion at the end. If you have questions or insights or opinions that you want to share, please feel free to weigh in and we can touch on them. But Aisling, I think you mentioned two things that I want to call out there is like the process, like the going from one company size to another. The companies that I see that I talk to, the smaller ones, maybe in the 15 to 150 space, even maybe, is a lot less about formalizing this big program of everything you're going to do for learning and development. A lot of it's just formalizing that it's happening at all. And for a lot of smaller companies, there is so much learning by doing happening. There's so many people doing things for the first time, doing new things, doing things we've never thought of before in different industries, that really, when you just call that learning and development and you build a framework around it, you're already doing so much of that legwork rather than having to feel this need to build out this massive program that maybe won't scale with you, maybe will, or is too much too soon, you feel. But really a lot of that work, like you said, is just kind of naming it and saying, that is development. You're developing right now, and helping people understand that they're doing that, because otherwise it can feel a bit like they're flying by the seat of their pants, or that they're, just not sure what they're doing. They're building the rocket ship as they fly it, but actually what they're doing is they're learning and they're developing. And it's much more, from a positioning standpoint, that's also beneficial to your organization to call it that.
Yes, and it's such an interesting point, because I think for most of us, and certainly from my own experience, my learning has all come from on-the-job learning, being given stretch goals, being given a piece of work that you've never done before, and you're thinking, God, I have no idea how to do this, but I'll figure it out. And 3 months on, you're like, okay, well, now I know how to do that, and I didn't know before, but I didn't sit down and do a course about it or anything like that. So I completely agree with you. It's about framing it. I do think from an employee perspective, that's probably just not as exciting or as engaging as a formal learning program. So I always think that that's the balance that you're trying to get, where you're thinking, look, no matter what we do in L&D in a formal sense, I know all my teams are learning, I know everyone's fully engaged, and I know if you're working in a fast-paced company, like that learning is so accelerated, right? But I'm not 100% sure that employees will always feel that then we're investing in them. So I think that's what you're trying to figure out with your internal development program, is how do I feel, I guess, in a way that it's a benefit for me if I am taking the employee perspective.
And it feels like that to develop that program, and especially to do it at scale, there is, like you said, that incredibly tricky balance of, the budget question, the learning and development budget question comes up a lot in this, of how guided should it be? Do we need to have a mandatory stream of skills that we prioritize as an entire organization to teach? Do we have a pick and mix where people can kind of come in and say, I want to learn about this, I want to learn about that? To Kelly's point here in the chat, the idea of someone who recently wanted to go back to college because they felt like they had still so much to learn. And could that learning have happened in organization? So, and then that's the free form element. Is there the mandatory, the sort of a universe of options, and the free form of, here's some money, go do something with it, and hopefully they do. And in a lot of cases, they may not. They may just let it sit and expire. So there's kind of all those things in tension with one another. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and I know this is not an overly helpful answer, but you almost have to do a little bit of everything, is my experience so far, and certainly in LearnUpon, like moving off that Excel sheet tracking into a more kind of formal approach. one thing we found is that what every department needs is a little bit different. So if you take your engineering department, they're really self-sufficient. They know what technical skills they need to learn. And really all they want you to give is access to something like Pluralsight, LinkedIn Learning, somewhere where they can go upskill on coding languages. Sometimes they want to buy books or courses, but they know what they need and they're happy to be pretty self-sufficient in getting it. Then you have your more soft skills driven teams like sales and customer success, who probably just need a little bit more of a hands-on approach, and especially because their work takes into account the context of the business. So they're, that's where, and I would say their learning on the job is really, really important, because the more customer calls you do, the more selling you do, the more you're learning that. So there's something about trying to build a program around the learning on the job that might work better for that team. So yeah, we found like a little bit of everything kind of for each department can work well.
Nice. And so taking a step back for this next question, let's talk about just even program development from scratch or from the get-go. Like, what are the things that you think of or have thought about as you've kind of ushered in a program like this and developed it? What are the things that you really had to surface and keep top of mind that made sense for what you were doing in that context?
Yeah, so the way that we've gone about it, and it's actually a project that we're testing out at the moment. So we built our competency framework all of last year. We launched it to the teams, we got it all rolled out, and we used it in our most recent performance management cycle. So that's all really, really good progress. But the next kind of question mark that we have is, how does this impact development? How do we weave in career development here? And what does it mean for our team? So the two things that we're trying to think about as we formalize that internal development program is, what's our philosophy for learning? And we've kind of touched on it a good bit, Max, in terms of we would be very aligned with the 70-20-10 model, which I'm sure people are familiar with, which 70% of learning comes on the job, 20% from feedback, and 10% from formal learning. So back to your point, is really emphasizing that you are learning the whole time that you are working, and how do we then make that feel meaningful, impactful for people? So that's one way that we're looking at it. And then just making the adjustments to the 70-20-10 per department. So again, like I was saying, for engineering, 10% formal learning is probably more like 30% formal learning, or any kind of technical role, depending on what they're trying to achieve. So you can kind of just adjust that as you need it. And then I think from an employee perspective, you're trying to figure out like, what's meaningful for me as an employee of this company. And usually meaningful translates into time well spent. If I do this learning program, if I take this LinkedIn Learning course, if I engage with a learning journey on our LMS, is that getting me where I want to go? And I think one challenge that we're coming across at the moment is a lot of progress for people is seen as promotion. And unfortunately, promotions don't come around as often as you might like. So we're trying to reframe progress around skills development, because that's what we can deliver to employees. Is I can help you develop the skills you need to master your role, and that's going to help you learn upon. It's going to help you at your next job. I can't guarantee that you're going to get a promotion, but it will definitely help your career. So I think, yeah, trying to make it meaningful for the employees and the team members that you have, and then also trying to have a really good philosophy around it so that everyone is aware of, like, I understand why it's built this way.
It's very interesting when you talk about the 70-20-10 model and you talk about philosophy, and something that's a huge soft spot for me, it's very close to my heart, is the concept of feedback in general. And I think feedback is a way to magnify every stage of the employee life cycle, but also especially in the learning and development space is so important, because it feeds toward what you just mentioned of like a shared understanding or a shared language amongst employees as well, and also up and down an organization too, as we talked with leaders and skip level and stuff like that. So for me, at least, what I've seen done really well in organizations, Personio being one example, is that element of feedback becoming almost a mandatory program of understanding how do you give good feedback. And I've spoken to enough people to know, you talk about giving feedback to your colleagues. Most people either roll their eyes or they clench up a little bit and they say, I don't want to do that. Or like, I don't know how to do that. And once you kind of enable that and allow for that, you can kind of see the other parts of that ratio. It's only 10% technically in the ratio, but it empowers those other parts of that seamless collaboration. And so for me, I think feedback is such an interesting thing to try to index on when it comes to developing your philosophy and your North Star. Like, how do we do that in a really tangible way? How do we give people a framework to understand one another and to collaborate with one another so that learning can thrive and learning can ultimately come up to the top.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and I couldn't agree with you more. 'Cause, a lot of L&D folks, we would say, a learning culture is one of our big goals. And if you really think about that, you're like, okay, what does that really mean, a learning culture? And I think it's what you've just described, which is like a continuous feedback loop. You're coming off calls, you're coming off presentations, and you have a really good relationship with your colleagues where you're constantly asking for feedback. It's something you're putting in your one-to-ones, and you can see that culture is what will really help drive learning forward. So I think one thing is, how do I build the culture with our managers, with our senior leaders? And I think they probably have to lead the way on that and create a bit of a safer environment that everyone feels like, okay, I can share that feedback. And then one thing that we're thinking about that might be interesting to share is, how can we formalize the feedback piece into internal development? So one thing that we're testing at the moment is, okay, if we're doing internal development with our customer success team and they want to work on a particular skill, and let's say it's presentation skills, we would be maybe recommending a development plan that says, okay, first of all, you're going to figure out the on-the-job learning, what presentations do you have coming up? What meetings are you presenting at that we can really practice this skill? What course can you take on our LMS that will help you develop any of the skills that you need? And then can you formally request feedback through our performance management system on it, and almost mandating a little bit that the feedback is happening. And I don't think that necessarily needs to happen for everyone, but I think it's an interesting way to try and build the 70-20-10 model into a learning program.
Yeah, you're almost taking it and bringing it into as part of the performance, as part of like the entire, like just the ways of working, really. Like you're making it such an embedded part that how can it not then have an influence on the culture, because you're making it the day-to-day operation effectively. And I think a lot of people often look at feedback and even look at L&D sometimes as like outside of their jobs to be done in their day-to-day work, when it's really not. It actually should be a huge part. A great organization knows that employees should be dedicating a fairly large segment of their time to that topic in order to then just bring everything else with it and make it so much better.
Yeah, for sure. And it's definitely an area for us at LearnUpon this year to really focus on, because we're noticing that if our managers in particular are not able to give feedback effectively, it's kind of infiltrating loads of different parts of the business, right? Not just in terms of learning and development. So it's even just saying, okay, at 300 people, now is the right time for us to really hone in on our feedback skills, because it's going to pay dividends for us going forward and as we scale out. So that's actually one of my top priorities for our manager group this year to train on. And I really like the idea of radical candor, and there's loads of great feedback models out there. So I think just having something that you all can use as a business and you have a common language around can be really powerful.
Yeah. And I think Kelly in the chat here mentions that they recently introduced check-ins with new joiners, take away some of the stigma by calling it a chat and perhaps not calling it like a formal feedback session, or this is a performance review or a performance check-in even. Sometimes that can have like from a feedback perspective and also just from a culture perspective of a learning culture, because a learning culture is also partially informed by a culture of where failure is okay too, because you're learning from your mistakes as well. So I think like wrapped up in that are these little, Kelly very rightly points out, little nuances, almost like marketing, like you're marketing just a bit differently to your organization about how to view these things and to keep people on the right track, but still to keep them as inspired as possible. And as learning professionals, as HR professionals, that inspiration piece is huge. It's a huge needle mover.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, it's interesting what Kelly says there. I think new hires in particular, it can be quite scary to have check-ins or get feedback early on. But one thing that we've done that is quite powerful is we do fresh eyes feedback about 6 weeks into having new hires, where they're giving us feedback as a business. So they say when you start a new job, you've about 6 weeks before you kind of forget everything you knew before and are fully embedded in a different way of working. So I think even giving permission to new hires to share feedback about the business, and we actually do it with our founders, which is quite powerful. And we create a safe space where people can, share what they want, and we're not sensitive about it or anything like that. And it means then when they do their own check-in, they're like, okay, well, feedback is part of the culture here, and it's all for a common goal of helping everyone perform better. So that can help as well.
I love that. I couldn't love that anymore. I think kind of before we head over to the Q&A, I want to ask kind of one last question for both of us. And that is, I mentioned earlier, HR professionals and L&D professionals, both kind of focused on very similar things. How or why or in what ways is it important to marry that HR and L&D strategy, and how do you do it in like a really meaningful way?
Yeah, and it's such a great topic because I think in learning and development, you can take it in any direction you want to go in, right? Like we're usually over a wide enough remit, and you can kind of become ineffective if you try and focus on lots of different things and there's nothing guiding the way. So the way I think about it is your HR strategy comes first and L&D then supports that. So like maybe even in a practical example, if your HR strategy is retention, that's going to impact the type of learning programs that you build. And like you mentioned earlier, Max, maybe you're more focused on who are my top performers? What are they doing? How am I helping them? Which, if your HR strategy is something different, that's going to impact the programs that you build. So I very much would take our lead from our head of people, who I work really closely with. She sets that strategic direction, and then we build our programs around it. And I think what's nice is it's almost like we have our business objectives, our HR objectives, and then our L&D objectives underneath that, so that you're always on track and you can check in then and see, okay, are we still delivering on what we said we were going to deliver?
And from my side, I mean, I think it's so important that they ladder up into one another nicely too. But and I think you're illustrating this very nicely, is like that there is that partnership element. It is not purely trickle down economics in terms of your company culture or anything like that. It is not that the HR strategy is set and then L&D and organizational effectiveness and all this stuff must abide by that strategy. They are partners in collaboration, but it is just as important that their results, that their key metrics all kind of level up into one another to tell that very nice story. But they are done in collaboration because, as we know, in any organization, the best work is done in collaboration with one another and not simply by passing things down.
Yeah, and I think that L&D definitely can input into the HR strategy. So like you said, it's not happening in isolation and then it's been given to you and you're kind of thinking, okay, well, I need to make it work. I definitely think having that relationship with your head of HR, head of people, whoever it might be that's setting that direction, you're being a partner with them, you're coming with ideas throughout the year, and you're positioning yourself as a strategic partner rather than as an order taker, which is what can happen to us in L&D a lot, is that the business is moving fast and you're constantly responding to it. So I think you have to push yourself forward in that way. And I think one thing that we're really passionate about LearnUpon with our customers and that we now use internally is learning should be driving business results. So, that's results for your people in terms of employee engagement, retention, and that kind of thing. But also your business has goals, your people will help you achieve those goals. What do I need to enable my people to do? So I think it's really important that you're dialed into delivering learning that has impact, that has results, your metrics. And I think that's probably going to be the key skills area for us in L&D to get really good at. And that can also just help with having a really impactful strategy and HR giving you that seat at that table.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, that levels up all the way, I think, to an HR generalist conversation too. I mean, at Personio, we have a system that touches each stage of the employee life cycle. So we see it from each angle of the practitioner space, and through integrations with platforms like an LMS like LearnUpon as well, which are great. It's like you see ultimately HR people, no matter where their kind of exact profession is or their exact kind of move is, they know their people. They know the people in an organization better than anyone else. And having that knowledge it shouldn't be a black box in your organization. It should be something that is open, understood, and not only feeds into an HR strategy, but feeds into a business strategy. Like those two things, as much as I said, the L&D strategy and HR strategy should be in partnership, that is just as much in partnership with your overall business strategy, because exactly, Ashling, as you mentioned, that feeds into the business and the ROI, the bottom line in general, like having those things together. So it is so important. But before we head on over to the Q&A section, I did want to quickly launch a poll. Of course, as you know, today's webinar is brought to you by Personio and LearnUpon. So I'm just going to leave this here. You can answer it at your own leisure. There's no pressure, of course. You just wanting to know if you want to learn more about Personio, about LearnUpon, about both of them and how they interact with one another to build out a really cohesive ecosystem. It's super important that you have, the exact right tools for your HR ecosystem. But just going to leave that there. Please answer at your own leisure, would be very much appreciated. But I think that takes us into the Q&A section. And I want to quickly mention, Noel mentions that they are in a small but growing company of around 30 people, and they're in the process of formalizing their learning and development. And they'd like to know, what are the risks of things to avoid by using a blended approach where they use internal and the offerings from external providers? What are some of the risks that you or I might see here, or just things to know, maybe even if not risks?
Yeah, I think the risk in general is that you try and do too many things at once, or that you try and jump forward before building the basics. So I think from Noel's perspective, it's, why, what's the purpose of the blended approach? What teams need that? And really trying to consider where the, kind of learning on the job versus the external learning is more valuable. Um, and I think like having something in place is better than nothing. So I think sometimes in L&D we forget how much progress we've made in our own companies until you speak with other companies. So I think for 30 people to already have that in place is really, really good. But I think, yeah, the risk is always doing too much too quickly. And sometimes, even though it feels hard to do, maybe pick a group or a team that you're going to pilot things with. And this is something that we've learned actually a lot over the last couple of years with LearnUpon, is the temptation to deliver to all employees first is quite strong. But actually, if you can step back and say, okay, I have a theory that this might work, I'm going to test it with this team, and then we'll scale it out, can just save you a lot of time and heartache and resources. So hopefully that might be helpful now to consider as well.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is it's a similar solution with a different risk. I think your biggest risk in the blended approach potentially is, again, yeah, giving out too much at once, and that leading to a potential lack of equality. And I don't mean equality in like the D&I sense, but I mean like equal employee experience, something that everyone is experiencing the same thing while also having it tailored to their needs, and ensuring that those who want L&D opportunities are taking advantage, and those who are maybe a bit more shy toward it or just not as, jumping on it, also are getting as much as possible from it. At 30, that's perhaps a bit easier because you can do a bit more of a heavy touch approach. As you scale, that becomes virtually impossible to a certain point. Like you eventually get to that point of like, it's so difficult. But ultimately, I think delivering that experience to each person, and ensuring that they have like an equal sense of what's available to them is so important with the blended approach. But yeah, and a champion strategy there, I think, is exactly right, and making it really tangible, like having folks that you determine are going to be a good test sample, and then seeing it how that could roll out at scale.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that as well, Max, like I think one of the risks that you can have, especially with a smaller company, is just the time for learning, especially for the formal learning. So people always have less time than, when you're designing a learning program and you want to make it, a really good blended experience, and you're layering in everything that you know from a learning and development perspective and adult learning theory, and you're trying to make the best program you can. But ultimately, people's biggest challenge or biggest barrier to learning is time. And so I think maybe another thing for Noel to consider is, do my learners have time outside of learning on the job? And if they do, what's the right amount, without making them feel overwhelmed? Because I think, again, if you roll out a program and you roll out lots of external learning, a lot of the time you're going to have people saying, actually, this is quite overwhelming and it's not the right time for me. So that just came to me there, just to add in as well.
No, and it speaks actually to Kelly's point, I think, at the very beginning of the going back to college, that someone was going because they needed to do it right for them. In this case, they needed to dedicate 100% of their time to go back into an institution to learn that. And that's probably because otherwise they would feel time poor and not have enough to focus on. But how we do that is so important. And we do it through like everything we talked about before, in terms of creating a program that is intentional, that it is aligned with a philosophy. And so I think this actually goes very nicely into the next question from Yen, who's asking, learning on the job is a big part owned by the learner themselves. So learning on the job for a large portion is owned by the learner with support of their manager. So what ways can we see how L&D can help formalize learning on the job? We talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but if we can build on it, how L&D can help formalize learning on the job and fostering it.
Yeah, really, really good question. Yeah. And I think I would almost say that it's learning on the job is more on the manager than the person. So I would almost just switch that up a bit and say learning on the job is really the part of the manager with the support of the employee, because I think the manager is the person that can help you see what you're learning, and they can step back and say, okay, remember 3 months ago you were here and now you're here. And actually a really powerful question that managers can ask their team members is, what's something that you're doing now that was hard 6 months ago? And that can really help if we think about maybe coaching questions or having coaching conversations with your team members, you can probably help them see how far they've come and how much progress they've made, because team members are head down, they're busy, they're stressed, there's a lot going on. So I would think that one thing that we're going to think about is how do we empower managers to have those coaching conversations and kind of formalize that I am learning a lot in the job. So that's kind of one thing that comes to mind for that.
I would have to just double down on that. I think managers in this case are multipliers, and you have an entire class of people in your organization that you can use. And I think it also speaks back to the culture element of like building a learning culture also starts at that level. Really, you can say as much as you can with your executive leadership team all the way from the top. That sets the tone, but it doesn't do the kind of on the ground opportunity to really embed behaviors in your organization. And I think you put it so nicely of like, even from like a one-on-one check-in perspective, having a manager just ask someone, what did you learn this week? Or what have you learned in the past little bit? Really as a framing opportunity. That's how you formalize it, is just you properly frame it and say, that was a learning opportunity. Because again, like you said, Aisling, there are things 6 months from now that your employees are just crushing, but 6 months ago they looked at it as a weakness and now it's a strength. But they don't know that sometimes. They don't know that they've actually come such a long way, and it's on your managers also to do that. So manager enablement is like a huge part here, just simply from an advocacy perspective as well. It doesn't have to be such like a drawn out process. It really can just help them with framing techniques, just like that in like a weekly setting maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other consideration in terms of formalizing on the job learning, it may be more from an L&D practitioner standpoint, is if you are developing learning, having some kind of reflection assignment or ability to reflect. So I think, like you mentioned, Max, your manager being able to do that in a weekly sense is what's going to really drive that forward. But then if you are having people go through any kind of formal programs, getting them to stop, reflect, and use anything that they can is a huge part of realizing the learning that you have done. And I think for most of us, if you think back on the last 6 to 12 months in any role, I'm always like, wow, that feels like 3 years work experience in 6 months or something like that. So I think when you do actually spend time reflecting on it, you realize how far you've come. So yeah, I think you can probably do it through your manager. And then if they are going through programs, you can help that from maybe an assignment perspective.
Nice. I mean, Antonin here mentions the challenge that they're having, which I think is actually speaks very well to this point, is the challenge is that they have many different target users, that a one size fits all approach doesn't really work. That totally makes sense from an L&D perspective. Like we talk about the blended, we talk about having something that makes sense for your organization, and managers are pushing for results. I think, actually, to both of our points, I think here is managers need to know that results come from L&D. So when they're pushing for results, they need to understand that L&D is actually a massive part of that equation, because it can have an exponential increase on results. Instead of just saying, what are you going to do? Like, instead of prioritizing the short term, there is that long-term thinking that we would hope for in a lot of ways from a lot of leaders and stuff like that. That is kind of why they're there, to think through the long term and not prioritize too hard the short term. But I think, again, that manager piece is why it's so important here, and why I think I've also heard 2024 being dubbed as the year of the middle manager in a lot of ways because of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Antoine, thank you so much for sharing. It's interesting, right? I feel like this is a whole other topic we could probably go into, but we expect managers to do so much. We expect them to wear a lot of different hats and deliver for the business. And I think the eternal enablement piece, you're almost saying to a manager, I need you to be a career builder. I need you to understand the competencies and skills that your team need. And then I want you to be able to give them feedback on how to get better at them. And I think that's actually a pretty big ask. So again, it's a pain point that we have, where managers often don't understand what L&D does, what the value of it is. And it's a really hard one to say, I want you to take time out of seat to do learning when I'm really busy trying to deliver business results. So I think, I'm not sure that I have an answer for it, but I do think there's a comms piece of L&D where you have to be really clear on what your team can do to support managers, and make, what resources can I offer you? How can I jump in and help you build a learning path for your team? And that's a way to get buy-in from managers as well.
Yeah, I mean, we even look at that from an operational standpoint. This goes back to even the HR business case and the L&D business case, blending those together, because the two things that you need for that to happen is time. You need time. Your middle managers need time. Your HR people need time. Your L&D professionals need time. And you also need the business case to do it. So the return, so the time and the return part there is how you are able to unlock that. That does happen at the top. That does happen in terms of investing in solutions and tools that give you back that time to then focus on learning paths and better enable your managers. That's kind of that logic, that order of operations. You can't do one as well without doing all of them in concert. Like it doesn't work as well. But wanted to end here with this question from Julia, which I think is a great place to kind of just double click, double down, make sure we're leaving with a good sense of what we're doing. So how do you overcome challenges in the business like understaffing, where employees don't necessarily have the time to do training because they're just putting out fires, and make sure that training is not simply a tick box exercise? How do you motivate people to think differently about training and how it can benefit them?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to this. So for the first one, in terms of overcoming the challenge, for me, that probably all starts with senior leadership alignment on the value of learning. So actually one thing about working and learning in a learning company is I don't have to work as hard to get buy-in anymore, which I need to remember if I ever move on, that's actually a really important part of our roles. But I've just seen the power of having our founders involved in the LMS industry means that they see the value of learning for employees, and that trickles right down to everyone. So there's never a question of, is this valuable? So if I was to kind of maybe turn that around for Julia, it's, are your leaders bought into this? Are your managers bought into this? Do they see the value of learning? And how can you embed that culture within the organization? But on the flip side, I would say, how do you motivate employees? A lot of employees maybe have a negative view of L&D. Maybe they've done it in previous companies and hasn't been impactful. So I think from an L&D standpoint, you have to make sure that your training is engaging, that you're utilizing, everything that you have available to you, things like gamification, micro learning, all the things that we know that our learners want, and that we're not putting them through courses for the sake of it. So I think there's almost two interactions there of, are my leaders bought into what I'm doing? And am I really being innovative with my learning to engage and motivate employees?
And I mean, I agree with all of that. And just to like even go down one more layer into it, some of the best results I've seen in terms of business operations and also with employee satisfaction and motivation. And this is, if someone was going to ask me which kind of development program, let's say you have a shoestring budget, you have only like 50 people, like what is kind of the development practice you would start to really embed and focus in on if you just didn't have the time or the resources? And a lot of that would come from co-learning, of learning the skills the organization has, having your employees as champions to teach one another, because the best learning happens horizontally. It happens like between one another, and it happens through some of the best results I've seen are when people do lunch and learns. They share things that they're doing in their role with other people doing a similar role, like in a sales team or a customer support team. Those opportunities already exist in your organization. You don't have to hire out for them. You don't have to do any of that, but they help you build when it's time to start building out those programs as well, and incorporating those solutions and building something much more holistic. They're a great practice to get into on top of the manager practice of what did you learn this week. And at the same time, you should be activating and helping people understand that a lot of the best learning happens with one another. So in terms of an organization that's going through some challenges maybe at the time, try to take those challenges, see who's actually crushing them and doing a good job. What are they doing right about it? And then have them advocate. And that can at least set the stage for a culture that can grow with your teams. Like it's at least something to start out with if you're just sort of going from zero.
Yeah, and I think a culture to aim for, and something that I think we'll probably look at and learn upon as well, is, to your point, Max, like we've all experienced that really powerful peer learning. And it's almost like something challenging happens in a week to a team member sees that, and the next week they're presenting a peer-led session on it and solving that problem and getting the team talking about it. And I think that motion is super powerful. And again, it's something that almost happens outside the scope of L&D, which is what can maybe make it challenging. But I think if you're motivating employees and it's built into maybe performance management, that having that learning culture is important, that's what can also motivate employees to jump in and do those kind of presentations.
Love it. All right, we've hit time for today. I want to thank everyone who tuned in, who asked a question, who was in the chat. Really appreciate it. And Ashley, I also want to thank you for being here, for giving us that good candor that we all enjoy so much. That looking through everything, really appreciate it. As mentioned, this is hosted by LearnUpon and Personio. We are here to talk through. If you haven't answered the poll, please feel free to talk through with either one of us in terms of anything in the future and helping with your L&D practices, your HR practices, all that good stuff. But I hope you got something from today. I hope you have something you can use in the future, and want to thank you for being here, and hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everyone. Talk real soon.
Thanks, everyone.